So guys, after clarifying whether testing and assessment is similar or different, so let's continue to the term of assessment. So let's go further to discuss on the assessment. So assessment is actually a popular and sometimes misunderstood term in current educational practice. Sometimes you might be tempted to think that testing and assessment is synonymous, or we think that both are quite similar. However, actually, these two terms clarifies different ideas. So tests are actually prepared administrative procedures that occur at identifiable times in the curriculum when learners master all their faculties to over peak performance, knowing that their responses are being measured and evaluated. While actually assessment, on the other hand, is the ongoing process that encompasses as much wider domain. So whenever a student responds to a question over a command or tries out a new word or structure during the teaching learning situation, then the teacher subconsciously makes an assessment of the student performance. Say, for example, when the teacher assisting the students with writing work by trying to jot down the phrases to a formal essay is actually the performance that ultimately is assessed by self, but it can be also assessed by the teacher and possibly by the other student. The activities for reading and listening also usually require some sort of productive performance that the teacher implies judges. However, peripheral that judgment may be, yeah. So then a good teacher never chooses to assess students whether those assessments are incidental or intended. So then tests are actually a subset of assessment, not the only form of assessment that a teacher can make. Seeing this idea of tasks can be useful devices, but they are only one among many procedures that teachers can ultimately use to assess students. Now, you might be thinking that if you make assessment every time you teach something in the classroom, does all teaching involve assessment? You might be thinking that way. If every time you are teaching something, then does all teaching includes assessment? And are teachers constantly assessing students with no interaction that is assessment free? So probably later you might be thinking that all process during teaching might include assessment. So, well, actually, the answer for this specific question depends on your perspective. For optimal learning to take place, students in the classroom must have the freedom of experiment, to try out their own hypothesis about language, must have the freedom of, to try out their own hypothesis about language without feeling that their overall competence is being judged in terms of those trials and error. In the same way, the tournament tennis player must, before a tournament, for example, have the freedom to practice, right? To practice on their skill with no implication for their final placement on that day of days. So also must learners have ample opportunities to play with language in classroom without being formally graded. So then, after knowing that the assessment and testing is quite different ideas or concept, teaching then sets up the practice game of language learning. It means that the opportunities for learners to listen, think, take risks, set goals, and process feedback from the teacher, and then recycle through the skills that they are trying to master. So then, how did the performance compare to the previous performance? So who will do that kind of activities? So based on the ideas of based on the ideas of testing, assessment, and teaching. So let's take a look at this an analogy of how to understand testing, assessment, and teaching as the whole. Well, if we can see test here, by understanding that test is a subset, tests are subset of assessment, not only the form of assessment that a teacher can make. So then we can say that test or test, let me change the color. Okay, test or test are part of what we call here assessment. And what about teaching? Test as part of assessment, then the whole concept of assessment and test are part of what we call here as teaching. So this is how we understand the ideas of test, assessment. This is how we try to understand about tests, assessment, as well as teaching. Okay, I hope you all guys understand the ideas about testing, assessment, and teaching by looking at this figure of test, assessment, and teaching. So let's move further to the roles. So in doing those kind of process, so what are actually the teacher's role during the learning process? So teacher here, at the same time, during the practice activities, will becoming the observer who will check or who will do the comparison on student current performance to student previous performance. What has been achieved during all process before and after learning. Then teachers should also identify which aspects are better than the others. Teachers should also find out is the learner perform as expected? Is the learner performance is achieved as expected by the teacher? And also about how does the performance compared to other in the same community. All the target of achievement achieved by the students are the same compared to those in the community. Those are the roles of the teacher dealing with the ideas of managing the task assessment as well as assessment in their teaching. So then let's move further to the ideas of formal. Sorry, this is mistyping. It's supposed to be formal. It's supposed to be formal and informal assessment. Let's talk further about formal and informal assessment. So here we have a clear distinction between formal and informal assessment. In informal assessment, it is mostly incidental. Yeah, it is mostly incidental, unplanned comments and responses along with coaching and other impromptu feedback to the students, which are embedded in classroom task design to elicit performance without recording results and making fixed judgment about a student's performance. So mostly the informal assessment done incidentally or unplanned. During teaching, probably teacher might do kinds like informal assessment. It can be in form of impromptu feedback to students um, in order to give comments about the student performance. But sometimes it is not recorded, and the recording is not becoming the result, and the teacher will not make judgment based on the incidental assessment given to the students. For example, in some, after the teacher observe the student performance, for example, speaking performance, for example, at the end of the student performance, the teacher can say, nice job, good work, pal, or by having a longer statement confirming the feedback given by the student. For example, I think you meant to say broke the glass, not you break the glass. That specific statement might be like a comment to revise the statement provided by the students which has incorrect grammar, but in form of a giving comment to clarify that the statement previously should be revised by the current stated by the teacher. So it is not a planned comment provided by the teacher to the student's performance. While informal assessment, it is mostly planned. Yeah, mostly formal assessment is planned or systematic exercises or procedures specifically designed to tap into a storehouse of skill and knowledge constructed to give the teacher and the student an appraisal of student achievement. So most of the formal assessments should be planned or systematic because it provides specific procedures designed to become the storehouse of the student's skill and knowledge constructed that later becoming as the recording of student performance or achievement. So then another question emerges: is formal assessment the same with tests? So what do you think? Is formal assessment the same with a test, guys? Yeah, we can say here that all tests are formal assessment. Yeah, once again, we can say that, we can say that all tests are formal assessment, but not all assessment is testing. Why? Sometimes when you do a test, you will provide scores, but assessment not necessarily need a score. Assessment can be given in form of comments or formal feedback or statement of or clarification of feedback, clarification of comments, yeah, and or feedback. Is it clear? So then, let's take a look at some function of the assessment. What are actually the function of assessment? So here, function of assessment can be in form of two ways, can be in form of two types. The first is formative assessment. The second one is summative assessment. So let's continue further on the formative assessment. What is meant of formative assessment? Mostly, formative assessment evaluates student in the process of forming their competencies and skill with the goal of helping them to continue that growth process. So formative assessment will evaluate the whole process of forming the competencies. And the key to formation is the delivery by the teacher and internalization by the student, of course, of appropriate feedback on performance with an eye toward the future continuation or formation of learning. So the keys is to format the delivery by the teacher and the internalization by the student. And all informal tasks belong to formative assessment. All informal tasks belong to formative assessment. So then let's check about the summative assessment. Summative assessment, the purpose of doing summative assessment is to measure or summarize, what a student have grasped, to measure or summarize what the students have grasped, and typically occur at the end of the course or unit of instruction. Summative assessment specifically implies at looking back and taking stock. So don't forget about this. So summative assessment usually implies at looking back and taking stock. Looking back and taking stock of how well that student has accomplished the objectives of learning, but does not necessarily point the way to future progress. So you need to have a clear differentiation between formative assessment and summative assessment. For example, what can we have for summative assessment? Summative assessment can be in form of final exam or general proficiency exam. Yeah, that is what we call summative exam. So then let's continue further on the ideas of norm reference testing, and criterion reference testing. Yeah, what is meant by norm reference testing actually? Norm reference testing is a kind of test which in purpose to place the test taker along a mathematical continuum in rank order. So scores in this kind of test are usually reported back to the test taker after the test taker has finished taking the test. So then later they will be given the score. Yeah, the test taker will be given the score right after they finish. So then each test taker score is then interpreted, yeah, interpreted in relation to mean, median, and standard deviation, and or also percentile rank. So the score later will be interpreted in the form of a mean, median, standard deviation, as well as percentile rank. Norm reference testing also typical is also a typical of norm reference tests. Yeah, typically, norm reference tests are standardized tests. Do you know what is meant by standardized test? Later we are going to discuss further about standardized tests, but mostly standardized tests are about tasks given to uh, others. It can be in form of like scholastic aptitude tests and then TOEFL tests, which are intended to be administered to large audience, yeah, which are intended that this test is given to large audience. And later, they will have fixed and predetermined responses in a format that can be scored quickly at minimum expenses. Then non-reference tasks will um, regard money efficiency. Yeah, money and efficiency are primary concern in this kind of task, because this kind of task, probably by doing a single task, they will be able measure on the whole competence of a task taker by doing a single task, a single kind of task. Then by doing so, they do not spend a lot of money. So then let's take a look on criterion reference tests. Criterion reference tests is designed to give test taker feedback. Yeah, this is becoming the intention, the feedback, usually in the form of grades on specific course or lesson objectives. So it is designed to give feedback in form of grades on specific courses or lesson objectives. Criterion reference tests involve students in only one class connected to a curriculum. It is not going to be given to a large scale of test taker, but it's specifically designed to for a specific class by connecting to a specific curriculum. It also requires much time and effort. Yeah, but doing a criterion reference test requires much time and effort from the teacher or the test administrator to deliver useful and appropriate feedback to students. But it becomes the prominent interest that no reference testing in that no reference testing in language assessment. Yes, so it becomes the prominent interest then norm it's supposed to be, it becomes the prominent interest than non-reference testing in language assessment. It means that it is better to have criterion reference test than norm. It's supposed to be norm, then norm, okay, then norm reference testing in language assessment. So the next topic will be discussing about the approaches to language testing. However, I would like to skip for this part and let you check on the part of a chapter of book that I've provided through UBL apps. So then please open on page 7 to 11 to have clear description or explanation about the approaches to language testing and brief history. So later we're going to, right after this, we're going to continue to the next section. Thank you.